Thank you so much, Susan, Abdul, and Maria. Now I'm going to invite on stage Alicia Surratt from Untitled Capital and Randi Zuckerberg from Zuckerberg Institute. They will be having a fireside chat about important traits to think like an entrepreneur.
Welcome. So thanks everyone for coming out today. Randi and I were just chatting in the back about how excited we are to talk to you all. As you probably saw in the program, this is Tech Up for Women's Important Traits to Think Like an Entrepreneur to Build Your Future. As our MC mentioned, my name is Alicia Surratt, and I'm the founder and CEO of Untitled Capital. I couldn't be more thrilled to talk about this topic because I feel like my life is all things entrepreneur, whether it's writing for Inc. or teaching at Columbia around entrepreneurial topics or doing media work for CNBC and MSNBC, giving feedback on entrepreneurs. It's just my passion. And to my right here, I have Randi Zuckerberg, who, and I'm going to go into detail in your background, but she's the founder of Zuckerberg Media, amongst many other entrepreneurial endeavors. So we're going to talk about that. We have about 20 minutes for the fireside chat, so I think that we're going to cover a fair amount of ground and hopefully have a lot of fun doing it. That's the plan. I will say we were laughing backstage about this when we were first approached about doing this chat. Initially, we were both asked to do TED-style talks. And I think on Randi's end, she has a 4-month-old baby. I'm 38 plus weeks pregnant, and so the idea of me waddling on stage, and then Randi was talking about the preparation, and we were both just so thrilled to be able to chat instead of do the solo presentation. So I think that this is so much better, right?
Yeah, this ought to be fun for everyone, two like barely coherent people on stage, but it's great.
We'll muddle through. It'll be fun. So, Randi, let me give you some highlights about your background. If I miss anything, shout out, and I think we'll cover good stuff around along the way too. So, first of all, I want to give a little bit of background about Randi's role as an author. I have several books on stage, which I'm going to refer to in the talk. But if you're not familiar with her work, this is Complicated. So this is one of the books that I really enjoyed reading. Pick 3 is another one. If you haven't checked this out already, it's fantastic in terms of just prioritizing all the different constraints in your life. And then finally, I have a little girl on the way, and so I'm so thrilled to be able to read Complicated to her soon. So maybe the parents in the audience might check this out. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But these were certainly multiple entrepreneurial endeavors. And then, as I mentioned, Randi launched Zuckerberg Media. You've also done a lot of media work, whether it's the show with SiriusXM, you produced the show for Bravo around Silicon Valley, you produced the animated series Dot. We were talking about Randi's investment portfolio, so you've been an angel investor. And then also, in addition to Zuckerberg Media, there's Sue's Tech Kitchen, too. So there's a lot of ground that we'll cover here. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So the session is really centered around women in entrepreneurship. And I want to start out and read a little bit of data to you to kind of set the stage for the scene for women entrepreneurs right now, and then get your thoughts on this. So data shows that since 2007, the number of women-owned firms has grown 5 times the national average, with over 1,000 new women-owned firms starting every day. Women are currently majority owners of 38% of US small businesses. This is up from 29% in 2007. These businesses employ 9 million people. They generate 1.6 trillion in revenue a year. And the general sense is that women are turning to entrepreneurship to follow their passion, gain flexibility, and take control of their earning power. Now, this is all in the context of the broader environment where we have more women attending college every year, we have more women coming into government, we have more women obtaining wealth, but at the same time, we have a dearth of women running Fortune 500 companies. We still have problems with the wage gap. And the women entrepreneurs who are coming into the scene are not getting the same levels of funding that are commensurate with their male counterparts. So, with all of that, to kind of set the stage, where are we in terms of progress? And is there anything that you're particularly excited about? And also the corollary, are you looking at one area in particular that we really need to focus on to improve?
Well, I'm definitely hopeful with a lot of those stats that you were talking about. So it was interesting because I actually never even thought there was a glass ceiling until I went out to Silicon Valley. I started my career here in marketing and advertising in New York City. The company Ogilvy and Mather, it was run by an awesome female CEO who had gone from being an intern at the company all the way up to CEO. And so that was the model that I looked to. And I remember saying to my mom, like, whatever, Mom, it's 1999, there's no more glass ceiling, like, we're done. And then I went out to Silicon Valley and I was like, oh my God, what is going on out here? And I proceeded to spend a decade being pretty much the only woman in every single room that I was in, at Facebook, at other tech companies that I worked with and was on the front lines of. A lot of, when I stepped away from Facebook about 8 years ago now, a lot of this next chapter of my career has really been about figuring out why was I the only woman in the room? Because there's so many more women graduating from top colleges than men, and it makes no sense why these incredible high-paying jobs, there should be no diversity in the room. So my research really showed two main gaps where we lose women. The first is at 8 years old. So I knew nothing about the world of children's entertainment, but like any entrepreneur, you see a problem, you want to solve it. That's why I jumped full speed into children's content. That's why I wrote Dot. I've produced children's shows. There's something you have to reach that 8-year-old girl, or she doesn't even know that she has that future. The other big gap that we found is in entrepreneurship. So I'm thrilled to see these numbers rising, but unfortunately for many women, they just don't have the funding capabilities, the peer network, and a lot of women kind of, they give up their company before they even get it off the ground. Yeah. So for me, that's why everything I do, even though it sounds like I'm, have my hand in a radio show and this, and it sounds like a motley assortment of things, everything leads back to how do we reach women at those two critical phases of their life to give them that support. Sorry, I know we're limited in time, but the one thing I will say is that there's all these emerging fields in tech right now, and I worry that too much of the discussion is around like how do we catch up over here when there's an amazing opportunity for women right now to get in the ground floor over here. When you look at blockchain, AI, cannabis, like all of these exciting emerging fields that are happening, if we don't get in right now, we are going to be having this identical conversation 20 years from now. Yeah. So that's a wide open field for women.
I totally agree, and I'll tell you, I've been an investor myself in the cannabis space, and it's just been so nice to see so many women get involved because they're not dealing with a lot of the legacy issues.
That's right.
Because
no one is really an expert in a field that's so new.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting because we were talking about angel investments backstage, and I've invested in a number of women-led companies. And I think what's also refreshing about women entrepreneurs starting companies is that they're starting companies, and I'm not going to say they're better or worse, I'm not going to get into that debate, but they're certainly different than the ones that we see out there. I find that the women starting companies now are very thoughtful about having diverse boards from day one. They're very thoughtful about the policies, whether that's allowing for childcare or paid leave or flex time. And so that's kind of a nice segue into the next question I wanted to ask you about, and that is, we talked about the macro environment, but now I want to kind of zero in on the corporate environment, and that is how that environment's changing. So, when you think about a lot of these legacy firms, they were often set up for like a male worker who had a spouse at home where the spouse took care of all the other things, errands, groceries, childcare, elder care, and now there's a movement more towards balanced lifestyles, right? And that's for very diverse workforces, men and women, different ethnicities, LGBTQ communities, and really allowing for more of these, policies that allow flexibility. So I'd love to hear your vision for companies of the future, and if there's anything that you're particularly excited about for a change in the cultural aspects that benefit women to really empower them to be, their best at work?
Definitely. I think that's a great question. It's interesting because there's this huge trend that over the past few years of these distributed workforces where everyone works from home. And I actually have both positive and challenging feelings about that because I think it's really difficult to have difficult conversations with people over a screen.
Yeah.
And I think more and more of the workforce is moving towards, all of us on the go, on mobile, working from home, distributed. It's leaving more of us to have how do you hire and fire someone through a text message or through a video chat? These aren't skills that we've learned. Maybe 10 years from now, that will be the normal and people will have learned how to have empathy through screens and manage people that way. But I think all of us right now are kind of stuck in the messy middle where the workplace is shifting, but those aren't skills that we necessarily have. And so I'm thrilled that workplaces are offering more flexibility that way, but I think it comes with a whole new set of challenges. Yeah. I think similarly, so many of us now have the opportunity to work for ourselves. More than 50% of Americans are freelancers working for themselves, which is also great, except I just had a baby. I work for myself. I could take as much time off as I want, but then I don't make money in my business. So all of a sudden that, that adds a ton of extra pressure because the conversation around maternity leave and benefits is moot if more than half of America works for themselves. Right. So I think there's all of these new and interesting opportunities that are bringing more people into the workforce, but it's causing all of these challenges that I think we might not even fully realize are challenges until another 5-10 years.
I think you make a really good point around empathy, and that's something I'm definitely going to look out for going forward because you're right about how do you incorporate that into the new environment. And I'll chime in on my own views here as I'm particularly excited about the focus on the wage gap analysis with large firms. I'm particularly excited about the focus on making sure leadership and the employee base represents broader society. And also, I love that people are starting to address that paid leave should be gender neutral.
Yes.
And that you want both parents at home in that crucial time.
Totally. You made a great point about boards and leadership that I made a mental note to come back to. So I've been on a lot of boards where I was like the token woman. Like you could tell that they patted themselves on the back for checking off the diversity box. Like, cool, we got a woman, like move on. It was never successful. Because when you're only one, I didn't feel comfortable speaking up in board meetings. I didn't feel comfortable disagreeing. I was outvoted on everything. And I ended up stepping down from every single one of those boards where I was the only one. But I serve on a board right now for an incredible company, the Motley Fool, a finance media company, and it is majority female board, even though it was started by 2 men. And what ends up happening in those board meetings is that a woman speaks up and then other women back her up and then really interesting discussions happen. And that was the first experience in my life that I had where I was like, wait, this is what happens when you're not the only one at the table.
Yeah.
And it's really like much better decisions get made.
Well, wasn't it Christine Lagarde who said it's not about being the first, it's about being the first before the second. So anytime I've joined a board where I've been the first, that's my next goal is to bring in the next woman.
That's right.
So I love that you brought that up. So let me continue on this front because I want to talk about your books too. So we kind of addressed how women are playing this crucial role in changing society and corporations. And so then it begs the question for all the people in the audience who may be considering taking the entrepreneurial step. So maybe this is something where, you're thinking about it, but maybe there's that fear, like what if it doesn't work out? There was a quote in your book, and this one, I'm going to pull a couple of quotes, but this one I'm going to pull from Pick 3 that I thought was really poignant. And it was really about your own thoughts around facing that fear. So, and Randi doesn't know the quote I'm going to read, so I'm kind of catching her off guard, but I love it. So the quote is, "Fear is oftentimes our worst enemy when it comes to trying anything new. I remember how scared I was to start my own business. I was worried I was making a huge mistake. Fear told me that I wasn't good enough, smart enough, fill in the blank enough to go out on my own. Fear crippled me in a way that made me second-guess my talents and hurt my first few major decisions as my own boss." But then you go on to say you realized your failures weren't anywhere near as bad as your fear told them they would be, and you pressed on. So, with that, and thank you for being so candid about sharing your experiences. I think that's one of the reasons I enjoyed your book so much. What advice would you give to women in the audience who are considering taking the entrepreneurial path, but have those same feelings of trepidation? You know, what if this is a total failure and it doesn't work out, and how do I move forward with that fear? What's your advice?
It's a great question, and I think the thing that I remind myself is that all of us are just like, so scared every day of our lives. I mean, I'm scared right now, honestly. I just when I think I've mastered something, I feel like I go back to square one. When I'm killing it at work, I'm reminded that I'm an amateur mom at home. You know, if I feel like I'm having a great day at home, something like crazy happens on the work front. And I once had a friend tell me that, you know, if you don't feel like you want to like vomit from nerves every few months, you're not pushing yourself hard enough in life. That might be a little extreme. Like that's a little extreme there. But I have learned to kind of love being nervous because it means that you care. Like if I was nervous walking up on the stage here now with everyone because like I care so deeply about this conversation that we're having. And I think if you ever get to the point in your career where you don't care enough to be scared, like you need a huge reassessment of your life and what you're doing.
Yeah. Your quote reminded me, somebody else told me that if you're not missing a flight every once in a while, you're spending too much time at the airport. That's the same kind of thing. But I'll add my thoughts on the entrepreneurial front is that I just feel like sometimes we focus so much on like, is this going to be a success or is this going to be a failure? And the truth is like life is never that black and white. And oftentimes it's just about taking that first small step, figuring out what you've learned, and then using that to process like where the next step is.
Totally. So you mentioned that I produced a Bravo show. That show was both the biggest failure and the biggest success of my professional life at the same time, which is like, you're like, how could that be? So I produced a docuseries about entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley for Bravo. It was my first project on my own after leaving Facebook. So I was like, yes, I'm gonna be a showrunner on this incredible television series. It's my first project on my own. I'm gonna prove myself. The first episode, a ton of people tuned in for, and then a lot less for the second episode, and a lot less. And then I got a call from the head of the network that they were moving it to 2 a.m. Oh, it gets better. Then they called me the next week saying, just kidding, we're running all of the rest of the episodes as a marathon at the same time as the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was like, wow, so I was like, how am I gonna pick myself up off the floor? This was my first project. Like I wasn't even sure that I should have left Facebook anyway and gone off on my own. And now my first project was like the biggest flop. But a few years later, when I wrote this children's book, Dot, that same executive called me and was like, you know what? Our first show together didn't work out that well, but I liked working with you. I think we have something here. Let's try to make a go with your children's book. And we turned it into an animated series, which is now in its third season in 80 countries around the world and has been just like much more successful than I ever could have dreamed. And it never would have happened without that bust of a show on Bravo. So I think sometimes thank you. So I think sometimes things that look like huge failures where we feel like, how am I going to peel myself off the floor of failure? Like sometimes those end up being the biggest blessings and gifts in our life.
Yeah. I think you're right. And it's both through the learning experience, but it's also taking that first step because Dot Complicated, the book, that was really an offshoot of the newsletter that you started, right? So if you hadn't taken that first step with the newsletter, then you wouldn't have had this very successful book to your credit. So I think that's great. But let's also talk about, for people in the room who are like, well, I don't know if I really want to start my own business. I love my job now, but I'd love to think in a more entrepreneurial way, right? So what advice would you give to people? Because I think, of course, you've launched companies, but at the same time, all of these endeavors, whether it's writing a book or going on Broadway, or like those are all entrepreneurial in nature too. You're putting yourself out there, you're learning. What's your recommendation for people in the audience who are like, I would just like to have some advice around thinking entrepreneurially? Maybe it's in my current role or just like as a thought leader, like what can I do?
It's great. And you're right. There's so many ways to be entrepreneurial. You don't have to just like up and quit your job and move somewhere and start something. Because you're right. Writing a book is an entrepreneurial endeavor. Molly, who's been emceeing this, has an incredible podcasting platform called Messy that everyone should be on. Like starting a podcast is an entrepreneurial endeavor. And so there are so many ways that I think more of us can think about having a personal brand. How do we put our personal brand and think about that? Because that's the only thing that we carry with us through our careers is what we've built around ourselves. So how can you launch some side projects that enhance your personal brand? But I also think a big part of this, as difficult it is around unplugging. If you're going to think like an entrepreneur and be creative, you have to have the discipline to put your phone down, because none of us are going to be creative when we are 24/7 responding to what other people want from us. Yeah. And I think that is one of the most challenging things, especially if you are in a busy job, if you have demanding coworkers or bosses, it's hard to feel like you can unplug. But I guarantee that none of us is going to change the world if we're glued to our phone all the time.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think you have to give yourself space to think creatively. And I noticed in your books you also talked about being a thought leader, and whether that's writing or challenging yourself to speak out or ask questions to be attuned to what's going on in the environment, but at the same time supporting other women who do, whether that's amplifying their voices or recommending others if you're given an opportunity to speak and pulling other people in. All of these things matter. So let me switch gears a bit to the repercussions of speaking out or being entrepreneurial. I want to touch on your book, Complicated, because as we know, the data shows that the more women speak out, especially if they're challenging norms and breaking barriers, you subject yourself to more online threats, more trolling, more just virulent content generally. And I really appreciated in your book how you talked a little bit about the effect that it had on you or how you dealt with it. So if you would indulge me for a second, I want to read another quote, which I really enjoyed. And this is your response to that, which I'm going to get you to comment on. The quotes are, "You have to remember that any time you share, you open yourself up to the judgment of others. The more successful you are and the more you have to say, the more people will be mean to you on the internet." I've seen that myself. There will always be people who are jealous or afraid, who don't have the courage, strength, or conviction to make an impact on the world. Don't let their insecurities and frustrations with their own lives slow you down or affect your day. And I love how you turned it back to them, where you were just like, it's their issue, right? It is their problem. But I think that you make a really good point in terms of putting that in perspective. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the advice you'd give to the audience. How do you deal with trolls? What can we learn from you in terms of that perseverance?
Yes. I once heard someone say, and I forget where it came from, but they said, remember, you're never as good as they say you are, and you're never as bad as they say you are. So I think it's easy for all of us to kind of if you read like something great about you online, like it's easy to let that go to your head, and it's easy to let the bad things go to your heart. Yeah. And we need to make sure that doesn't happen. It's interesting. I just sort of posted something about this on Instagram yesterday. So my dream my whole life actually was to sing on Broadway. My dream was not to go be on the front lines of social media. That didn't even exist when I was having dreams as a girl. And but I got rejected from every theater program that I applied to. So there you go. After a decade in Silicon Valley, though, I started to feel like I was missing something in my soul. And when I left, I did an interview with the New York Times where they asked what I was going to do next. And I was like, I think I'm going to move back to New York and work on Broadway. And they wrote the meanest article about me that I think I've ever seen in my life. I mean, about how I was a joke, that it was so mean. Let's fast forward 8 years later now. I just won 2 Tony Awards this summer. And a New York Times article that quoted me last week quoted me as Broadway producer Randi Zuckerberg, and I was just like, F you, So I think the only person that needs to believe in you is you. And if you believe in yourself, it doesn't matter what anyone else says, because life is long and there are many chapters of our lives. And so I that was just such a moment for me, because I was like, well, even when no one else believed that would happen, I believed it would happen, and that's all I needed.
I love this, and I will say that an F-bomb is probably one of the best ways to kind of end this session. So let me give a final shout out. First of all, please join me in thanking Randi for being so awesome and sharing her insights.
Thank you.
We're both very appreciative of the audience for coming early in the morning and listening to us. And
Can I shout out two of my colleagues that are here? Please. So two of my colleagues, Brian and Michael, are in the back. They have a booth. We do some really awesome stuff around mentoring and peer networking. I am running from here because I have a 4-month-old baby at home, as I mentioned, but Brian and Michael are way more fun and cooler than I could ever be, and so I hope that a lot of you will go and say hi.
Awesome. Thank you, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.